Hello and welcome back to the first actual episode of this massive Soulsborne Let's Play, where we look into the lore of the series in a direction that I don't think a lot of other people have explored thus far. It's a fairly unique take, I want to say, and I hope that it's as exciting to other people as it is to me. We are the first episode, the prologue, started at the very end of Dark Souls, one half of the final bosses. And now we're going to go back to the very beginning of the series and just, take things from the very start, where this all began, at least in a sense. We are going to be using a very standard build for other people, not something I typically run, but make things awkward for myself. We're going to go Faith. I am typically much more of a quality player. I don't like using items, I don't like using spells, but you have to sometimes make things uncomfortable to grow as a person. You have to push yourself, and there's an element of that in Dark Souls. It's kind of intrinsic to the entire ethos of the series. Ethos, probably. We're gonna have to go with the Old Witch's Ring for lore purposes. I'm going to regret not using the Master Key, I'm pretty sure, but this is necessary. Aside from that, we don't particularly care about... I have sort of sense of what I want to do thematically with these characters. We're going to name our characters after the goddesses of the series, with the first one being Lautric's goddess. I hope that I've actually spelled this correctly, but if I didn't, well, then that's actually pretty funny. And that will be more or less it. We're going to start with this, and we'll see how it goes. Hopefully not terribly. We begin with the FMV. This is something that
in the age of ancients,
something that Miyazaki pays a lot of attention to. So the details are important. We have an area that looks a lot like the Ashen Lake of that we will eventually see in this game, but it also looks like the Hunter's Dream in terms of the pillars. You see the pillars again in the Things Betwixt in Dark Souls 2. Those pillars is another example of repeated elements in game design and area design within all of these games.
And cold, life and death, and of course, light and dark.
The mentioning of disparity a little bit ago is curious. It's one of those words that you don't expect to hear in a fantasy intro. And when something like that happens, it's usually something that you should pay attention to in these games.
The souls of lords within the flame.
One of the sort of interesting aspects is that parts of this don't really make sense. Why does Nito have fire as opposed to the Witches of Chaos? Them having fire makes sense, but Nito is not really known within the game itself as being an especially prominent fire user. Maybe it's nothing, but it's interesting that Nito's original character design is talked about as being on fire in a previous iteration. So there might be something to that, and that might be why, the fire begins with him.
With the strength of lords, they challenge the dragon.
We come to the core of Gwyn's character arc, and this is jumping ahead, but it's fairly noteworthy that Gwyn is in this FMV using lightning bolts prominently as his like major method of attack, but when you get to the final boss, those lightning bolts aren't anywhere to be seen. His soul can be turned into one, but he's primarily using a flaming sword, which is out of character based off what we are shown here. We also have Seath, a very important character, and a very enigmatic one. We will come back to Seath quite prominently. Like I said in the previous video, the fact that this is all about the Age of Fire is very intriguing because the previous design of this game in particular was based around the concept of water, according to their interview.
Even now, there are only
We have the first mentioning of embers, something that will come back in Dark Souls 3.
but only endless nights.
And one of the biggest things to consider in these games is what undeath and hollowing actually mean. What does humanity mean? Because it's not behaving in a way that we would typically expect it to. These games are very much allowed in make up their own sort of context for terms that we would otherwise consider familiar. That undermining of our expectations is a big part of what went into the making of these games and what makes them as fascinating as they are,
Yes,
because there's a
indeed.
mystery to the rules of the world. It has a sense of being consistent, but also confusing, and managing to have both of those traits is actually an incredible accomplishment on the part of FromSoft and Miyazaki.
And led to the north.
It's kind of,
Where they are locked
we're jumping ahead here, but there's
the end of the world.
a very interesting element in this area that, and part of the parts of this game is that it sort of invokes some of the mythos that Dark Souls 2 will eventually talk about. Dark Souls 2 has, I believe, a storyline. I'm trying to remember off memory, so I may not get everything quite right, about what seemed like human trafficking of the undead to somewhere in the north by the Vangarians, a tribe that looks very Viking-ish. So, interrupting that, this motif, the being in a cell and having something thrown down to you, is something that gets repeated later on at the very beginning of Sekiro. I think that there's an intentional parallel there in that, well, I won't say, I don't want to commit to anything right now. I have ideas, but this is one of those things that is percolating rather than solved in my head. There is a thing I want to draw attention to. This is eventually one of the bosses you face. It's an interesting use of foreshadowing. But there's another element that's interesting about it, because if I recall correctly, this is not a boss that you are facing this run through. I am uncertain if it's the one that you have or can run away from or can try to destroy with a black firebomb shortly. But you eventually fight a very different demon to get out of here. And that is an example of often areas have sort of two parallel tracks and storylines going on simultaneously. In this case, we will leave the asylum in this instance, but later on we can come back once we have a different key and access another half of the asylum that sort of provides a mirror to this first tutorial section. This mirroring is something that occurs in a profoundly in a number of areas in all of these games, and it's always subtle, but I'm going to try to highlight them as they show up. We have our poor Hollowed here, not really doing a lot. We got a dead rat. There will be plenty of rats. It's kind of interesting that this rat is so much smaller than the ones that you will eventually see. I think the games often very intentionally play around with the scale of things. I believe that there might be something to that, but that is going into a level of thinking that might almost seem conspiratorial at this point, so we'll keep things a little more standard for the moment. I don't read or watch a lot of like Dark Souls lore videos myself. I am much more well versed in Bloodborne and Dark Souls 3. So this series is in part a way to force myself to go back and play the games that I sometimes consider to be a little bit of a chore, relatively speaking. I have Bloodborne as my favorite, with Dark Souls 3 being a close second, and that is probably a controversial statement among a lot of people. I dread playing Dark Souls 2, but we're going to try to do that. We're going to try to commit to that, and hopefully I go through with it. But one of the videos I have stumbled upon in some of my writing was mentioned that this enemy with the sack on his head is kind of a fascinating inclusion. There's not a lot of cases where the corpses of enemies on the ground have identifying features, and this sacked enemy sort of stands out as being interesting. I don't have a lot to say about that at the moment, but thought it'd be worth mentioning. We have our first inclusion of water, and it's sort of standing water that we are trying to leave. We have ourselves climbing out of the water, and it's a motif that does get repeated, but other than trying to like bring up the Rakuo this early, it's not a lot I have to say about that. This area as a whole is not going to be profoundly interesting, so I'll take some time to talk about more the sentiment of the series. Bye-bye. So yeah, that is the Asylum Demon, not the other demon that we saw. That demon will be in a fight later on. If you beat the Asylum Demon during this first iteration, you will actually get an item. Typically, you do that by taking the Firebomb option as... yes, right. Taking the Firebomb option. And we don't want to do that because we have the more important lore thing. So we're gonna get our shield. The East-West shield. It is something that we'll come back to. We're just gonna start to put together our cleric equipment. Anyway, back in late last year, I was working on a different project, and as part of that, I did research into Dark Souls 3 DLC that I had not actually played. It came out after I beat the game, so I never got around to it. And what I found in looking through it actually was quite fascinating. It exceeded my expectations by a considerable amount, and sort of it completely reworked the way I thought about the series. I'm going to take a break here to mention that this is one of the first examples of deep foreshadowing. There is a stairway here that has been destroyed, and as a result, we cannot get that item. If this were a 3D action game where you have jumping, getting that would be trivial, but as it is, it just feels frustratingly out of reach. This sentiment, this inclusion of paths that you don't have the ability to access yet, and that you have to go around an inconvenient way to get to, is a major thematic element of the series that only gets implied and never really stated. Other interesting thematic elements come shortly. We have a ball that rolled there that wasn't terribly easy to see on my screen. Hopefully it was a little better for everyone else. I should be actually listening to this, sorry.
Then lose my sanity. I wish to ask something of you. You and I, we're both undead. Hear me out, will you? Regrettably, I have failed in my mission, but perhaps you can keep the torch lit. There is an old saying in my family. Thou who art undead art chosen, and thine exodus from the undead asylum maketh pilgrimage to the land of ancient lords. When thou ringeth the bell of awakening, the fate of the undead thou shalt know. Well, now you know. And I can die with hope in my heart. Oh, one more thing. Here, take this. An Estus flask. An undead favorite. Oh, and this. Now I must bid farewell. I would hate to harm you after death. So go now, and thank you.
This is our first introduction to any member of the Astora Knighthood. Gives us our Estus Flask, very much a center element of the series. We can open our way back to the bonfire, and meanwhile, we want to go up to where the boulder was pushed down, find some annoying undead who we, with our mace. Anyway, I experienced the Dark Souls 3 DLC, and it kind of changed my meaning of the my interpretation of the series dramatically. And so I want this playthrough to be an explanation of that, to share my experience with everyone. Yes. Alright, so what we're going to focus on is primarily lore. It is going to be the central sort of emphasis of this playthrough. I don't know how the gameplay is going to be received. I'm not terrible, I'm not great, I'm not especially experienced in most of these games. I'm usually very bad at replaying games. This will be my second complete Dark Souls 1 playthrough, hopefully. And in part, it's possible that this will help me learn parts of the game that I had missed previously, and people might be able to correct me on things that I have missed or misinterpreted. People might be able to mention mythology that I might have incomplete knowledge of. It is not my specialty, but it is incredibly important to figuring out what's going on in this series. With that said, we've killed our first boss. He was a bit of a pushover. I want to talk a little bit about what he dropped, because this was a demon, our first introduction to the demons of this series, and he dropped a humanity. Tiny black sprite found on corpses, used to gain 1 humanity and restore a large amount of HP. Black sprite is called humanity, but little is known about its true nature. If the soul is the source of all life, then what distinguishes the humanity we hold within ourselves? And there's something about the actual art for the humanity graphic that I want to draw your attention to. First, it is, I believe, intended to evoke the silhouette of a person, and probably a child. You can sort of see the head narrowing at the top, we come out to shoulders, and the bottom fades away to sort of a ghostly ending, but there is a silhouette of a head. I think it actually becomes a little more prominent in the twin humanities later on. Twin sort of invoking the idea of childhood, that a birth of twins. We have twin princes showing up in the final game, so twins as an element of the series is something that is tied to children. And you can also see this human design later on in the Ember graphic in Dark Souls 3, and also the human effigy in Dark Souls 2. That being said, the more controversial thing I want to draw your attention to is that I think the humanity graphic is supposed to be evocative of a vagina. There is a considerable amount of that kind of yonic vaginal symbolism in these games. The most An arguable example is probably the Bed of Chaos boss that we will be seeing quite a bit later, but you could Google it. It is very much a uterus.
You. Give me warm. Give me soft.
We have our crow friends. There is one of these in all three games. I believe there's also one in Demon Souls, the precursor to the series. We're about to leave the Undead Asylum. There's a couple things I want to mention before we do that. First of all, the fact that it's called an asylum is kind of fascinating. It's themed like a prison, and sometimes the distinction between an asylum and a prison aren't that large, unfortunately. But asylum can evoke somewhere that a mental institution, somewhere that people are kept to be protected from themselves and from others, and that I believe got evoked somewhere in the dialogue previously. But asylum can also be somewhere that people go to hide from an oppressive regime, someone who might be threatening to you, asylum seekers. And true to the nature of these series, I think all three interpretations are intended to be relevant. Aside from that, we have one of our first depictions of an area that has gravestones that we go up to. It is a theme that shows up very prominently in Bloodborne, but also in various parts of Dark Souls 3.
In the ancient legends,
And it's noteworthy that it starts here at the very beginning of the series.
that one day an undead shall be chosen.
We will get back to somewhere that I believe is evocative of this particular area shortly, in like probably one or two videos.
Leave the undead asylum in pilgrimage to the land of the ancient lords.
Going to try to be a little quiet during the cutscenes, let anyone who's new to the series experience them. I would like this playthrough to be accessible to someone who has absolutely no knowledge of the series. That's one of the challenges talking about it. Talk about 5 different games where even the people who are experienced can't remember the details of all 5 of them. So by going through it, we have, a active presentation of one to focus on at every given time. So aside from the humanity graphic, if you go and look at the Ember graphic, it kind of looks like the corresponding element to the humanity graphic, the penis. There is a sense, I think, here of the Bloodborne, as we'll get to, uses a lot of themes drawn from childbirth, and I think those themes are actually present in Dark Souls in a much more subtler way. In this particular case, there's a sentiment that it's interesting to me that the demon has humanity. We normally would think of those two things as being not interactive, that demons are not human. But in this world, demons have humanity. Whether it is something that they actively possess or something they took is maybe another question. This is our first crestfallen individual.
Let me guess. Fate of the undead.
Sarcastic, depressed,
But there's no salvation.
hopeless.
You'd have done better to rot in the undead.
Dark Souls, the series, is about how to be in the face of something hopeless and maintain your momentum, your energy, your ability to go on. And it's actually an extremely personal message, I am fairly convinced.
In the ruins at the base of Blight Town. Ring them both, and something happened. Brilliant, right? Not much to go on. But I have a feeling that won't stop you. So, off you go. It is why you came, isn't it? To this accursed land of the undead?
Faith build, so I don't know. Got a little bite at first. This is fine, whatever. We'll get back to resistance. Resistance is actually a really fascinating feature. It's considered a worthless stat. It in some ways is a worthless stat. I think it is intentionally, it intentionally does what it does, and we'll, like I said, get back to that. We'll take our levels. I don't really care too much about min-maxing or caring at all. Hopefully that doesn't bite me in the ass. I want to mention that we have here our first Firekeeper. No response, she can't speak. She's interesting because she is... First of all, Firekeepers in Dark Souls 1 behave very differently than Firekeepers in the other games. In Dark Souls 2 we have Shanalot, I believe that's the name, the Emerald Herald. And she is your sole Firekeeper. She was responsible for your leveling up. In Demon's Souls you had the Maiden in Black, again responsible for leveling up. In Dark Souls 3, a single Firekeeper who levels you up. In this game, though, you level up at bonfires, and the Firekeeper only reinforces Estus Flask. They do seem to charge the bonfires they're attached to. Some later on that will become relevant. The other thing is that she's behind bars, and this idea of someone behind bars is another motif that will come up a lot, and I think sometimes it will have a direct intention to call back to here. We could go further down, but we're not going to go there yet. It's too early to talk about that. Last video I said I would talk about some things and never did, and that's to a certain extent intentional. There are things that will come up that without the other game I can't really talk about them and be clear. So I want to mention them, but talk about them more in detail when we get to them. The one thing I will mention that I will clarify is that what was noteworthy about the cutscene during the Sister Frida fight is that the blood flows from her as though it were water. And similarly, the Ariandal pours the fire out of his vessel as though it were water, as though it's a liquid. And the two come together and create the incineration of the room that is the second phase of that fight. So, I think that within the series, humanity is the sort of sentience of the characters. And sentience alone, the ability to act alone, isn't sufficient for what we would consider humanity. What we consider humanity has another part, which is the ember, the purpose. That you have to be able to act on your own, but you have to be able to act on your own for a reason. And the undead curse is a curse because you lack embers. You go hollow because you can still act, but you can't act with reason. And then, once you get the embering, you have a purpose again, but you also have mortality. The dark sign that you have begins to burn. Your ash can only last so long that it's possible to be immortal if you have immortality with no direction. But this is not really the greatest of states of being. That what worth is your mortality if it comes at the sense of your, what we consider humanity. This theme is not explicitly obvious in these games, but I think it lurks beneath the surface, and it becomes more obvious once you go to Sekiro, a game that is deeply and immediately critical of the idea of mortality. That the immortality that your character has is what is responsible for causing the disease that is inflicted on all of the NPCs that you interact. That the more you take immortality, what you're doing is that you are sapping from them and killing the land around you. This ties into the idea of the Fisher King, which is something that I will bring up in greater detail once we get to one of the earlier parts of Dark Souls 3. I have a belief that a lot of these games are inspired by Arthurian myth. And that is, again, something that I will get into once we get to those parts, but a little bit of foreshadowing. I also, having mentioned that the liquid theme of the Sister Frida fight, I want to recall that Firelink Shrine was originally going to be a water temple, that Dark Souls was going to have Priscilla here, presumably in a temple near here, possibly where that statue was. It currently stands, the statue of a woman holding a child, and she could no longer be here. The water dried up, as the devs themselves put it. There is, in my mind, the possibility that this area would be more lake-like in the official version, because they talk about water being here where the bonfire is put. And if Priscilla was in the center where the bonfire is, hypothetically, presume she gives you your first weapon, your sword. That would make her the Lady in the Lake of Arthurian legend. That is, speculation. A lot of this is going to have to be speculation. I am trying to basically do an archaeological dig of what this game used to be in the heads of whoever was conceiving it at that time, and in that sense, we are going to be very much not obeying death of the author, because in this case, what the author believed, what the author was going for, is part of what we're fascinated by. This doesn't invalidate a lot of the other takes of Dark Souls. Like, you can have your own interpretation of mythos, and I think that is actually very much intended. I want to take a break before we talk to this NPC to mention that in one of the interviews for Dark Souls 3, Miyazaki is quoted as saying that Dark Souls is in some ways an incomplete game, and I like to think that it has been completed by players, by their discoveries as they moved along. I'd love to say that the nature of this incompleteness was something deliberate, but it is both deliberate and accident in different ways. There's a lot going on here, but I think part of it is that the author wanted this to be a series that is interpreted, that the act of trying to interpret it is part of the discovery process. So nothing I'm doing here invalidates that, and should not be seen as invalidating that. What I'm intrigued by, though, is what the author was dealing with when these were created, because there's hints of it, and I think it tells a very fascinating story. We have this character, a character who seems quite villainous. He is, I believe, a reference to a Demon Souls character. I don't know a lot about that character, unfortunately. Interestingly, his haircut makes another appearance later on in Bloodborne in a very peculiar place.
I believe we are not acquainted. I am Petrus of Thurland. Have you business with us? If not, I'd prefer to keep a distance, if possible.
He's socially distancing. How thoughtful. I like to think that this series might be helpful to someone who is... Well, many of you who are stuck in isolation right now, it's a tough time, and what better way to lift up your spirits during that than to talk about a world where a wasteland is being created by a ravaging plague that can't be stopped, and where money has no actual value.
Hello there.
It's,
I realize
a big change from
we retain our distance.
a way of
I
being
also want you to
escapist.
know that it is not meant in ill will. Here, take this as a token of peace. No, go ahead. It's for you.
He gives us here the first instance of money in the game. It is completely and utterly worthless. And coin made of copper, its face shows Old Man McLoif, god of medicine and drink. Even coins of great value in the world of men have little value in Lordran, where the accepted currency is souls. Those who dream of returning to the outside world are fond of carrying these around. I'll have more to say about this once we get the other coins. It's kind of interesting, the mentioning of the outside world. That's sort of evocative of a lot of things that go on in Bloodborne. even this early in this the series. So, you know, I would say that a lot of the things that we see in the later games were things that Miyazaki and FromSoft had been considering for almost a decade prior to where we actually are. I should pay a little more attention. We've got our lovely little firebomb tosser. There is something that we will talk about a little bit later, but we talk about undead in these games, and there's a lot of enemies that, you know, qualify as undead. These seem generally to be much more skeletal. Later on, we do see zombies. It is also a very noteworthy enemy. He has, I believe, a slightly different set of armor than all the ones out here, and he may be the first instance of the sort of Red Eyes enemies that show up later in Dark Souls 3. That's speculative, deeply speculative. The Red Eyes enemies have a there's something very much going on with them that I can't fully explain in Dark Souls 3. And it could be possible that that thought was in the series this early. Now, we come to a part that I find a lot more interesting now that I've talked to you. I've talked at length about water. And we first go in to the first area of the entire series by entering an aqueduct. Actual flowing water, which is incredibly rare, but a very limited amount. It might be the case that at one point this aqueduct was closed and was bringing forth a much larger degree of flow. The themes of water are very much there from the very beginning, and they're never obvious, but they existed, and I think they're important. I think they mean something. We have a door that doesn't open from the other side. We obviously can't go that way yet. And now we get to the Undead Burg. Right. Anyway, we have here plenty of skeletal enemies. These battle axe skeletal enemies are pretty similar to something that we will see later on in Dark Souls 3. But we also have enemies that are much more clearly, obviously, zombied. And sometimes I kind of wonder whether there is an intention to make the zombies and the skeletons not allied. That just because undead are undead and hollow doesn't mean that they're unified. There's a way I have of interpreting areas in these games that I'll explain a little more in detail later on. It's a little hard to do in these in Dark Souls 1. Dark Souls 1 is very abstracted relative to later games. We reach another one of those broken stairways that imply that something else is up there, but that we can't get to. And we feel inclined to want to explore that this draws our attention to it as being important. And I think that as we go through the fog gate, we come to one of the big symbols of this series. So we feel like we want to explore up there, and we have a way given to us to potentially explore up there. We can, you know, make what looks like a jump. If I'm not mistaken, though, I can't even remember how to jump in this game. That is one of the big frustrations of trying to play through this series. Jump and Estus between Bloodborne and Bloodborne, the rest of the series changed buttons, and so sometimes I will try to jump in a Dark Souls 3 way when we have to use a different method. But we try to jump and we can't make it. That the obvious path is broken, and the next obvious path, the one that looks like, oh hey, it is there for us to use, is inaccessible. That it's something that we are not capable of. And that's frustrating, that this entire segment... Ah, yes, a dragon. Right. This entire segment is supposed to, like, you know, very much frustrate us that this thing is here. Yeesh. Right. Right. That's fine. This segment is supposed to frustrate us, that it tempts us that what we want is up there, but it's out of our reach, that it's inaccessible, that we aren't capable of doing it. And that's the kind of thing that can make a person crestfallen. So we have our first bonfire. We're not going to quite use it yet. Still got plenty of, you know, mishailing to use. It's very slow, so it's generally best used out of combat, I suspect. These enemies are here to teach you how to use the kick that I am not great at using. Sort of a tutorial fight. And what's this? We have another passageway that we have access to. We go down. We have an ambush. Not a particularly effective one, but... And we have our first merchant.
Well now, you seem to have your wits about you, hmm? Then you are a welcome customer. I trade for souls. Everything's for sale.
I don't have a ton to say about this guy. I wish I did. There is something that I find interesting about him, but I don't have, I think, the knowledge to talk about it. I suspect that maybe if I knew more about Dark Souls or Demon Souls, I might have something more interesting to say. In the meanwhile, he's fairly standard.
Thank you kindly.
I know that you can kill him to get an item early on. We are not going to do that. We're going to play a very white tendency game.
I hope you've got plenty of souls.
I should, you know, just as a precaution, check his talk.
Things are getting treacherous in these parts. A horrible goat demon has moved in below. And up above, there's that humongous drake and a bull demon too. If you stick around this place, it might end up being your grave. Here, I'm not here to chit-chat. We talk business, or we talk nothing at all.
Very...
Hey! What's the matter?
We're pretty rude. Anyway, as I was saying, there's that area up there that looks like it's somewhere that we're supposed to go, and that we can't get to, that the way is broken, and the other solution is something that is beyond our ability. But we go through, we, you know, grind out our time in depth with the much more poorly equipped, more explicitly zombie enemies. We climb a ladder. And look where we are. Now, we can attempt to make the jump, and, you know, with my luck, probably fail it still, but... Oh, we got it. There's a sentiment here of, you know, if you persevere, if you think outside the box, if you are willing to go into the pits and grind, you can accomplish things that you didn't think were possible. And what do we get for our time? We get a light crossbow. It has its uses. There is a certain value to having archery weapons in these games, even if they're not really going to be your primary weapon. I know that Dark Souls 3 does have a short bow build that people have run through the game with, but it's not especially recommended for one, as I understand. Now that we're here in Undeadburg, and we're coming up to a part that had, confused me in a way that I couldn't fully articulate when I first played these games. These holes in the world feel so bizarre that why would on Earth would a city exist like this? And I am kind of inclined to believe that in a very literal sense, you have a city being built on top of a second city. It kind of invokes the ancient city of Londonium, which became London, where previous runes served as the foundation for the next layer of the city. This below us will be Lower Undeadburg, which we'll go to later on. And that structure, the structure between Undeadburg and Lower Undeadburg, is something that gets reused in Bloodborne, where you have Yharnam and Old Yharnam, and similar to Lower Undeadburg here, Old Yharnam is very definitively on fire relative to, regular Yharnam and regular Undeadburg. I also sometimes feel that this particular area almost sometimes, to me, I want there to be water. I want there to be, canals here. This weird death fall zone that you have going across these bridges just seems utterly bizarre. There's always these areas in these games of, emptiness that you can fall into. It's almost as if the bottom of the world has fallen out and what used to be there has, gone away. So one of my ways of reimagining what these games might have originally been is that we're in a city that may have had canals, a sort of Venice built on top of the ruins of a previous civilization. So now we come to a pretty fun part. Everyone's favorite, get through the ranged enemy, and then you get into an area with a whole host of not friendly enemies. It's a difficult section to just run through, but you can do it that way. We will be a little more thorough. I do not recall which doors the Residence Key opens up, so I'm going to be trying things to remember, see if I have fallen upon one. Oh boy, there's the one behind us. Let's get you. Alright. This is an area that is probably pretty tough for the people new to the series, coming into Dark Souls for the first time. One of the things that is very prominent in the series are spiral staircases, and that means a lot in various ways, but one of the things I located while looking up is that staircases like this were often made so that attackers would find it harder to use their right hand to attack up the stairs, whereas people attacking down would be able to have a cleaner sweep. And I kind of wonder if that sort of thought went into the design of this tower design that gets repeated in later areas, because you have a lot of cases where your weapon will clink off of the sides very frustratingly, which is apparently true to real life. That is the kind of attention to detail that I would be utterly unsurprised went into the design here. For thoroughness, we will deal with our tossers. That could have been less than ideal, but not so bad now. Rip to that item. Alright, so we've got a little more peace, so we can explore the area in a little more detail. We have a bit of a house with a chest. I'm not going to check for mimics, I'm pretty sure this isn't one. The gold pine resin. I know that gold pine resin is something that shows up in the parallel area of Dark Souls 3 fairly early. I don't have a lot more to say about it at the moment, but it is another case of having those parallels. The kick button. So bad at it. These enemies have a very, despite looking similar to the other one, trying to be a little misleading, because they use swords, they're a lot more aggressive, requiring a different strategy to get through. There's a nice tactic of mixing things up subtly on the player, so you have to remember that you pay attention to details. Spear users in this case will be a lot more cautious, and sword users a lot more aggressive. You have this room. Black Firebomb. It is another item we could use upcoming in our soon-to-have fight. We have this guy just chilling out in here. He has an interesting view. There is perhaps a foreshadowing of the area to come, but one of the things that is prominent throughout Dark Souls 1 that frustrated me a lot during my first playthrough is that there would be so many areas where it would look like a path existed, but that you could not access. And that looked like foreshadowing, but really emphatically didn't ever lead anywhere for the player. I know that one person I've read has mentioned that one of the towers in here has a path that looks like you can access to, or previously could access to, but that can no longer access to. And I recall that the interviews for this game, here's an example, a door that may have existed at one point but is now very obviously barricaded off. This area was not intended, I believe, to be used the way it currently is, and that required removing pathways. That is something they talk about very explicitly with Firelink Shrine. And I think that a lot of the blocked off doors that you see throughout the area is meant to, you know, be sort of a testament to where the game previously went. We have again another spiral staircase. It's very amusing. The Dark Souls 2 interview makes a joke about having to find other ways to let the player go up besides spiral staircases because they were used so much that players complained about them getting boring. But spiral staircases, I think, are a very intentional motif element that we'll talk to a little bit later once we get to some of the more iconic ones. So we have here another fog gate. It's interesting that the fog gate itself, it gets used in so many different ways throughout the games, and it's not especially consistent. Sometimes it will go into boss arenas, sometimes it doesn't. I believe the majority of Bloodborne will not have... I don't think any boss in Bloodborne will have a fog gate unless you're going back after dying once. Whereas Dark Souls 3, some bosses will have fog gates, some bosses will not. And I think there's something that is meant to be conveyed through them, but we'll get. I'm still, working through that. This is an interesting lesson. Oftentimes, bosses have a sort of theme to them, and for example, Gwyn at the end of this game is, in a lot of ways, kind of a parry check. The easiest way to beat him is to parry him, and that is something that the developers joke about during the DesignWorks interview for this game. This boss has a sort of its own morale, its own message, and that is, if you want to make the fight easier, make sure to check what's behind you. Those enemies will be shooting at you during the fight if you don't take them out first. And now that they're gone, we have an easier fight. It's not a particularly hard fight either way, they'll watch me screw it up. And here we go, a Taurus demon. I wonder if I can make it do my favorite thing. I don't know if I'm going to be able to... Almost. If you have the right positioning, you can get him to backdash off the platform, and it's pretty amusing, but I have failed to put that off. The first time it happened, I had a good laugh. I think there's maybe an intentional in-joke about being able to convince bosses to jump off of things. It's something that later comes into play with... comes into play with this is actually intense enough that talking is making it harder, while also making it harder for me to think about what I'm saying. It comes into play with Ceaseless Discharge. You can convince him to jump off the edge. This is an extremely sloppy fight. Who knew that talking during play would make... Ooh, he stepped on me. Let's play it safe. I don't want to wipe here. That would be embarrassing. Oh god, don't push me off the side, please. This boss... the demon on a bridge motif gets played again in Dark Souls 3. Yeah, that backdash, if you can get that at the right time, it will be humorous, but it looks like we're not going to be seeing that this run. Wow. Almost! I've failed. Although, it would be pretty appropriate if I ended up, screwing myself over. Having him knock me off. Trying to manipulate him in position. I'm sure if, you have the fight planned out in a speedrun style, you can... Oh, Jesus. Oh, he's gonna try to... Yeah. Okay, enough screwing around. You won't get to see the funny way to end, but he's over. He's done. We have our victory achieved. We have the fog gates opening. We get humanity again from a demon and homeward bound. The item that allows you to return to your last bonfire whilst without losing your souls. And I think with that boss done, that's where we'll stop for today. There might be a Dark Souls 3 shortly after this, I haven't decided yet, but there's an NPC coming up and I want to group him with a segment afterwards, and doing that right now would make this video a little too long, so that will be enough Dark Souls 1 for today, and Next time we'll get back to everyone's favorite Solaire.